So, in conclusion, another reason the South was facing such difficult times during the war was because most of the war was happening in the South. So, as the Union gets further and further into the heart of the Confederacy, the more and more scenes like this the Southerner would see on a daily basis. So, with Sherman's March to the Sea, especially in 1864, we're going to see huge areas of the South just leveled to the ground or nearly leveled. Okay, medicine in the war is a pretty popular topic just because we've come so far since then, and it seems just so barbaric at the time. But you're dealing with people operating in a different time with different knowledge. So um, the sick and the wounded were a huge number of the army, and when it came to doing medicine in the war, a lot of that's going to revolve around the battlefields. And in the South, especially, a lot of doctors were actually pulled out of practice in communities to go into the battlefield, to go into the army and serve for the Confederacy in that way. So, battlefield hospitals were usually barns, houses, outbuildings, anything that could be improvised to lay out the dead and the wounded in. At the Battle of Pilot Knob, which is down in southeastern Missouri, General Sterling Price, has an 1864 grand raid where he's going to take Missouri. It ends up to be a huge flop. But right near, about a half mile from this earth fort, is a church, and the church was used for a field hospital. And even today, if you go in the church, you can see the floor is discolored in a lot of spaces, and that is because the massive amounts of blood that were spilled on that floor during that 1864 battle. So, when it came to medicine during the Civil War, little regard was given to a soldier's condition when they enlisted. The armies were willing to take just about anybody at the beginning. One of the rules were you had to have a thumb and you had to have an index finger, because you had to be able to cock the hammer on your musket, and you had to be able to pull the trigger. So if you could do that and you could walk, even if you had a leg that was slightly shorter than another and a limb, if you could shoulder a musket and you could cock it and load it and pull the trigger, then you were given a pass. And that is only going to get more and more relaxed as the war goes on. But in all reality, it was disease that killed soldiers more than battle. You've got measles and malaria, you've got typhoid and dysentery, you've got infections, you've got sexually transmitted diseases from all of the free living that the soldiers were doing in the battlefield and on the march. And you've got unsanitary conditions. You have an army of tens of thousands of people, and they are doing their business whenever and wherever. This is a time before germs were really known about to a great extent. Hygiene was questionable at best. You've got men who will not use the latrines, which were essentially just a trench in the ground next to other men, because we're entering a time period where everyone was very modest, and so to publicly defecate or urinate was considered a great offense to many soldiers, and so they went wherever they were, and could get some privacy, and that usually led to some nasty conditions. So, stories of soldiers writing in their journals and writing letters home about waking up and rolling up their blanket roll and discovering that they had been sleeping in something less than desirable. And so you've got a lot of guesswork going on. If a soldier would come to the doctor complaining of dysentery, which was violent diarrhea, essentially, very, very painful, just body emptying condition. And so doctors would prescribe what were laxatives, really, and which only compounded the problem, and made it much much worse. And so they were just doing a lot of guessing as to how to treat these things. Now, women are going to get different opportunities. In the Union, you're going to see a lot of women become nurses. With the Confederacy, they're going to become the chief operators of business. Most of the men, if they're of fighting age, they're out fighting. Even if they're beyond fighting age, younger or older, they're out fighting. And so women are going to be the ones who are operating businesses. They're going to be overseeing farms. They're going to be overseeing and handling slaves. And it's going to challenge the cult of domesticity. It's going to challenge that big idea that we should keep women in a certain place, that women should be held to the home, and they're the fairer sex and they cannot handle the pressures that men handle on a daily basis. And so the war is going to change that for women, which is going to lead to some unrest, because even after the war, when African Americans are given the vote, women are still not. And so we're going to see that as a major point of contention. Okay, so switching gears here. You guys read some slave readings and have been posting on the blog about that. The Emancipation Proclamation is without doubt one of the most famous documents to come out of the Civil War. And it's easy to say at the beginning that the South fought to keep slaves and the North fought to free slaves. But as we should have learned by now, it's never as simple as that. And that is just simply not true. Many Northerners believe that the war was not about freeing the slaves. You read Sullivan Ballew's letter, and he has a different take on it. There are instances of soldiers writing home and saying, if I thought that this war was to free slaves, I'd pack up and go home right now. You've got soldiers from the Butternut region of southern Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois who shared a lot of those sentiments. And General Grant himself at one time said that if he thought this war was to free slaves, that he would surrender his sword to the other side. So, it's something that's often taught, but is just really not backed up by historical evidence. Now, Lincoln, however, does promote the proclamation as a way to preserve the Union. Lincoln he's sharp in this, and he knows what to do to get a reaction. Now, Lincoln, we said, was morally opposed to slavery, but he says from the outset that he is doing this. He is doing everything that he's doing in order to preserve the Union. And slavery, if it goes by the wayside, that's just a plus. So he's going to promote this Emancipation Proclamation as a way to preserve the Union. It's going to be a political move. It's going to drive the Confederate States back, he hopes, that by releasing the slaves and causing havoc in the minds of the Southerners, at least, if not in the heart of the Confederacy. And so in January 1st, 1863, now, Antietam happens in 62, and the Union has a victory there, and that's going to give Lincoln the encouragement to pursue this proclamation. And so it's going to take effect in 63. The slaves in the 11 official Confederate states were freed. Now, that does not include Kentucky and Missouri, which were stars on the Confederate flag, but were actually border states in the Union. So Missouri still had slaves all the way until 1865. We were the first state to voluntarily free those slaves, but we still had them until 65. And so he's encouraging these slaves to run away. And so even though that happens, even though Lincoln passes this proclamation, the slaves are usually not free unless the Union Army was nearby. So even though this order goes out, a lot of people in the Confederacy, they're not going to listen to it. They're not going to obey it willingly. And a lot of the slaves are not going to leave home. They're not going to leave their plantation, or they're not going to leave their master's land unless the Union Army is nearby. So Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Maryland, they're not freed. Portions of Louisiana, where the Union Army was even there, they were not freed. So it's just one of history's mysteries. It's one of these things that I want you guys to catch, that Lincoln has been portrayed as the great emancipator, but there's a question, and I want you guys to answer this, not right now, but we're going to answer this in class. Is who is really responsible for freeing the slaves? Was it Lincoln because he passes the proclamation? Was it the Union Army because the slaves are usually not free unless the Union Army was nearby? Or was it themselves? We see the slaves over time running away. We see them organizing protests and getting out of the South and getting into Union territory. So, who was responsible? So think about that, and then that's something that we're going to write and talk about. Okay, so finally, to conclude here, black contributions to the war. In the South, they're going to serve as personal and camp aides. A lot of soldiers are going to bring slaves with them. A lot of the slaves are going to work in the fields. They're going to man hospitals. They're going to work in the stores. They're going to try to take the place of some of the white men that are off fighting. And the South, here's another sign that the Confederacy is desperate. By 1864, the Confederacy is drafting slaves and they're drafting free blacks into service of the Confederacy. So that should kind of give you pause to think, all right, if the Civil War is a war to free slaves, what do we have going on here with the Confederacy drafting these blacks in? So something to think about. Now, in the Union, you've had African Americans serving since 1862, and by the time the whole conflict is said and done, there's over 200,000 African Americans who served the Union cause during the war, and that makes up about 10% of the Union Army. So they definitely contributed from the beginning, and even more so after emancipation. The most famous is the 54th Massachusetts. If you've seen the movie Glory, that's who this centers around. And we see the commander, Robert Goldshaw, who is the son of a wealthy family in Massachusetts. And we're going to see a lot of similarities like that in black regiments. You're going to see a wealthy, reformist New England commander leading these African American troops. And so here they are. This is their most triumphant remembrance here at Fort Wagner, which was a Confederate fort in South Carolina that they are storming here. And so that's the war at home. You looked at the Union side, we looked at the Confederate side, and now just summarize what we've talked about here. This is more of a complex WSQ, so this will be a little longer summary. Make sure that you get the high points. Make sure you don't get wrapped up in tiny little details. Look for the main ideas, and remember your 3 hot questions, which are going to come from your Bloom's taxonomy chart.